Gayle, we've just spent 2 wonderful hours together and you've shared your story very openly with me, and I'm really touched by that. And for the viewers, what I'd love you to do is just encapsulate your story.
In a short amount of time. Okay, so I would say that I came from a very challenging childhood, very abusive, starting with, well, essentially my mother, who led the way since the minute I was born, when she found out she was having a female and not a male. And I turned it around. Instead of living like I did for quite a long time as a victim of my story, I am now the hero of my story. And now, because I figured out the secret to forgiveness. So that is the biggest gift. The biggest gift that I received was actually the challenges of my childhood were the biggest gift in my life, because I was able to figure out the secret to finding forgiveness and the power and the freedom that that gives you.
Now, I asked you what thriving meant to you, and I love the answer that you gave me, and I'm going to just read it out. You said, I feel I can do anything I want to do. I feel unencumbered. Now that, you know, this project is all about thriving instead of surviving in the face of challenge or trauma. You certainly faced challenge or trauma, and you're now thriving. And what I'd love you to do is just share 1 or 2 of those resilient strategies that have enabled you to live a life that is thriving.
I think it's about having a fearlessness, not being worried, just knowing you just have to want to do something enough, and then you'll figure out how to do it. So just putting your mind to something and focusing on it, and not worried, not being worried about what other people think, and just, you know, the steps will happen. But just having this unrelenting passion to do something.
And when we spoke, my impression was that your life has been somewhat of a process to get you to thriving, and that's what we're hearing from other contributors too. And there are 3 things I know that you focus on specifically that have helped you in that process. Do you want to tell us what those 3 things are?
Well, there's 3 major steps. In general, I talk about 7, but the 3 major ones in overcoming abuse. If anybody is unkind to you, if you suffer any kind of abuse with anyone, is understand who that person is. So I say dig into their past. So, and primary relationships are the most important, where we need to focus on first. So in my case, it was my mother, and I dug into her past. The second thing, and by digging into her past, I saw all the hardships that she suffered and endured that she never shared, because she was of the generation, you don't hang out your dirty laundry. So that drove me to research. It drove me to genealogy research, finding vital documents, finding family members I never knew were alive, who I interviewed, who shared with me stories. So once I dug into her past, I began to understand her, and I saw her now as a wounded child. I went from looking at her as my mother who should love and adore me to a wounded child. And once I was able to look at her that way, I reframed how I looked at her. That's step number 2. So by understanding who she is, I dug into her past to understand the pain that she suffered. Then I reframed number 2, which is reframe how I looked at her. So I now looked at her no longer as my mother, who's on a pedestal, who should be able to love and nurture me, because she's not capable. I look at her as a wounded child. And when I was able to reframe how I looked at her and look at her as a wounded child, I was able to actually feel empathy for her. Because first of all, I'm a wounded child. I was a wounded child, okay? So I know the pain of a wounded child. So now I felt empathy for her and compassion, and that allowed me to forgive her. So that's number 3, is forgive. And when I use the word forgive, and I know there's a lot of energy around the word forgive. I know people, I just did a workshop, people are like, I have to use the word resolve, not forgive. Because everybody has a different definition of forgive. So I want to address that here. Because forgive, for me, is about myself. It's not about the other person. It's about, when you forgive for yourself. You don't forgive for the other person. And it's not that you condone that person for however they behaved that was not justified, but you forgive them because you realize they were incapable of anything else. You realize that they did the best they could at that time. So you don't forget, you forgive. And once you forgive, you go from being that victim to being that hero. So I went from being the victim of my story to the hero of my story. And that is my message, and that's what I'm here to help people with.
I love that. And you remind me of Marianne Williamson's quote, which is, just because I forgive you doesn't mean we have to do lunch. And that's the point. It's not about forgive and embrace, it's forgive and release, isn't it? I love when you talk about moving from being the victim to being the hero. So you've shared those three with us, and I know in the 2 hours we spent together, you have shared so much more, and I'm so grateful for you being very, very open. And I think, in fact, you've identified another 5 or 6 resilience strategies that have enabled you to get to feeling you can do anything you want to do, which I love. So Gayle, thank you.
Thank you very much.